Internet, a psychoanalytic talk, and today we're going to talk about the somewhat controversial topic named Positive Projective Identification. So I've talked about projective identification, its differences with projection a while ago on this channel, and I'm going to quickly summarize what is projective identification proper before moving on to the more controversial take of this video. So projective identification is the idea that basically, fundamentally, there are states and emotions and ways of being that an individual cannot stand, and they're gonna throw it out on someone else. But that throwing out is going to be the projective side of things. But there is going to be an identification on the side of the person that's receiving it, meaning that something is going to be thrown out and received by the other. For example, and this is purely fictitious example, but it's to give you the idea. For example, a husband is gonna scream on his wife because he's angry, feels a lot of anger, but inside of him, he might feel a lot of fear, a lot of dread, because something has happened in which he's terrified. The wife is then going to feel that fear, dread, and terror. And basically that fear and dread and terror is the projective identification not of the aggression of the husband, but of his fear and terror, which harkens back, in psychoanalysis at least we would believe that, it harkens back to a traumatic parent-child relationship. For example, the mother might have been very abusive, very forceful, very brutal in her way of interacting, and the child might have integrated that through a means of projective identification. But for Klein, and that's very important because she's the one that theorized the concept, the idea is that the baby cannot stand all of that aggression, all of that hatred, all of that will to destroy within. So he throws it out onto the mother, and the mother has to survive that. And what is happening is that the mother receives it, and then, if we are to believe psychoanalysis and Bayon's way of conceiving of things, it gets detoxified and restituted back to the child. And in therapy, that's very, very true. That, for example, there are things that are thrown into us as therapists. Things like aggression, hatred, sadness, despair. And all of those things are something we will feel. As the patient does not necessarily feel them, he passes them on because he can't deal with it. And the whole process is going to be for us to accept those feelings and be able to give something back to the patient so he can start processing those feelings that were beyond understanding for him at that point in his life. So that's projective identification in a nutshell. So I've simplified it a lot, but I wanted you to get the idea. What you have to understand with it is that it's always used, virtually always, as a net negative. What is projective identification in the relationship is always something that isn't positive. It's always something that's going to be massive, destructive, disruptful, and that can threaten the ego being the sense of identity of the individual. So here we are confronted with something that's at its core fundamentally negative. But, and this is very interesting, in Celani's book, Fairbairn's Object Relation Theory in the Clinical Setting, which I loved, and I'm talking a lot about on this channel, there's this very interesting idea that Celani drops very quickly, this idea of positive projective identification. And that's something that resonated with me because it's something that I always felt was completely feasible, that something of sympathy, love, kindness, gratitude could be shared both on a conscious level but also on a projective identification level. And so for Celani, the whole goal of therapy is for the therapist to be able to use all of his loving, caring, and nurturing self and to use projective identification to give it to the patient, to not just to process all the bad or negative elements that the patient develops, but to really, he himself, give a bit of who he is to the patient without the patient necessarily conceptualizing of it or consciously realizing it. But he says that it's very important because it's that positive projective identification from the therapist that's going to create a fundamental identity basis and structure what Fairbairn calls the central ego, i.e. the conscious aspect of the mind and the stable aspect of the mind that's at ease with itself and with others, very fundamentally and very basically. So, in this context, who we are as therapists, the love, the care, the nurturing, is going to be, in a way, transmitted unconsciously to the patient. Of course, it's going to go through a lot of therapy. It's not like you do it once and you're done. No. It's through the repetition of the patient being able to give his bad elements, quote unquote. That doesn't mean that the patient is evil or anything, but that means that there's sins that he can't or she can't deal with, that he transmits to us. We receive them. We, to use a Bionian language, detoxify them and give them back. But in giving them back, we also give a bit of ourselves, a bit of who we are and of our caring nature. And the patient can start building on it, as it's going to offer a stability. Because what's going to happen is that through that positive projective identification, the patient is going to realize that slowly but surely, he does start to adopt a bit of what we're doing in therapy. He might adopt ways of thinking of the therapist. He might start adopting techniques the therapist uses or offers to use. He might even start developing the same kind of wording as the therapist. He might start seeing things differently, and all of that constitutes the fundamental, let's call, nature of psychotherapy. Is for Celani, and I agree with him, of us giving good things to the patient and the patient being able to build on them until a point where he's internalized the therapist so well, so brilliantly, that he can go on with his life without us. And that's the complete and total aim of therapy, to be able to reach a point where the patient is like, yes, you've helped me, I feel less stressed or less this or less that, and what you gave me and who I've become, thanks to the work, will now allow me to face life. Because life is an unending set of problems, events, grief, sacrifice, and so on and so forth. So it's, in a way, psychodynamic never ends. But what changes at the end of therapy is that the patient can then deal with all of that stuff on his own. He does not need another human to do it, because he's internalized through projective identification, the good therapist. So that's something I fundamentally agree with, and it's something that I came to realize also through a special type of work, working with people with Down syndrome in my case, where I realized that I felt a lot of sympathy for them. And I was like, this is funny, because it really, really looks like projective identification. And it was. And when I read Celani, it completely clicked in my mind, because people have always, other therapists have always said it's not projective identification, it's just identification on the whole. But I always disagreed with that, as I think that you can, in a relationship, create a relationship in which you project the good stuff in you. You don't have to just project the bad. And when you think about it, why would it only be bad elements that you'd project? You could also project good elements. Of course, not necessarily in the same context, right? Because that's very important, I think, the context. But it's ludicrous to think that only bad sins or unacceptable self-images get projected. I think that also our positive feelings for people or humans are projected. For example, people that say, oh, you look so much like him or her, oh, you remind me of my sister, or you remind me of this, or you remind me of that. They're projecting. But in doing so, they're doing something else also. They're also projecting and identifying you with someone, and you're identified with that person as well, in the sense of like, oh, cool, I'm part of something. And you start to be linked with the other person. So I think the projective identification, even though it's always been conceptualized as something fundamentally negative, I think it's not. I think it's something that can have a positive version, and that it can create sympathy in a relationship, love, care, and so on and so forth. And it's not because there's positive projective identification that it takes away the bad projective identification. I think that both exist, and they're just like on a spectrum. I know it's a very fashionable way to say it, but that's how I think of things. There's good and there's bad, and you can use them in both ways. And when you think about it, there's no reason why it could only be bad or should only be bad. It could also be good. And I think that gratitude And the expression of gratitude and what we feel when we receive the gratitude is fundamentally a positive projective identification mechanism, and it helps us, how can I say, connect to each other. It helps us understand each other, and it helps us feel the depth of the positive elements of our kind, like care, love, compassion, the will to help, the kindness. All of that, I think, is a result of positive interactions that bring with them a little je ne sais quoi, all right, of the other. And that little, I don't know what to translate it into English, is the subtlety of psychotherapy, is that little sin is in a way so subtle, so delicate that it escapes any form of classification, any form of real fundamental understanding or to box it in into something. It goes beyond all of this. It seeps in into human nature itself. That in a way we fundamentally live with others, and we use that, I think, that positive projective identification all the time with others, people we love, people we like. And I think that it's one of the main forces of why we develop relationships. Because if we were not able to do that and to receive it, then basically we would be stuck in a state of withdrawal, a complete shutdown from other people. And we might directly think of schizoid, but I think that schizoid people also are capable of it. Maybe not in the same way as others, or maybe fearful of what's going to happen, but that doesn't mean that they can't do it, I think. And of course, this is big generalization, so take it with a grain of salt, or perhaps 2 grains of salt. But that's basically my gist, and that's why I felt that I needed to talk about it, because it's too common to still consider projective identification as a net negative, when I think, and I've explained why, I think it really isn't. It's a fundamental aspect of our human nature, and a great aspect of our human nature. So that pretty much ends the talk on positive projective identification. I hope you liked it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.